Welcome to Windy Night Stories. Tonight's story is by an anonymous author. There's no attribution. The Demon Spectre, a true ghost story of Virginia. Some years ago, while traveling with a friend through that portion of Virginia which forms the southwest corner of the state, we stopped for a day or two at one of those old-fashioned wayside inns which are now rarely to be met with beyond the boundaries of the Old Dominion. The weather was delightful. The scenery in the neighborhood varied and beautiful, our quarters more than comfortable, and as we had traveled many weary miles without making any lengthened halt, we determined to put up, as the phrase is, in these parts, and recruit a little before proceeding on our journey, which had originally been undertaken more for pleasure and pastime than with any other object. We had adopted the fashion of the country, and were traveling on horseback, with a change or two of linen stowed away in our saddlebags, and an overcoat and umbrella strapped behind, ready for use in case of emergency. Our horses were strong, well-gaited and spirited, capable of carrying us safely over roads and through a country but little adapted to any other kind of locomotion, and enabling us to take bypaths and shortcuts through regions but little known abroad, though abounding with objects of remarkable and rare interest. We had been sojourning with our kind and obliging host of the inn but a day or two, when one morning he informed us that one of his neighbors, who was a candidate for a seat in the state legislature, that day would give a fish fry to his numerous friends, personal and political, and that we had been invited to attend. Never having witnessed a real old-fashioned Virginia fish fry, we gladly accepted the invitation, and were soon on our way, in company with several others, to the place selected for the festival. A ride of a mile or two brought us to the place. It was a beautiful spot of grass, shaded with great oak trees, in one of those beautiful dells which abound in the mountainous regions of Virginia, and near it a clear mountain stream went murmuring and dashing along over its rocky bed. When we arrived, many had already assembled. Rustic tables and seats had been erected. Huge fires were blazing in various directions, before which every variety of meat and fowl were roasting, while numerous parties, with line and net, were invading the sparkling waters of the brook for specimens of the finny tribe, with which to give name to the entertainment. Nearly everyone took part in the sport, and thus the greater part of the morning passed away. By noon, large numbers of delicious mountain trout had been caught. They were soon dressed, the table spread, and all sat down to the tempting repast with appetites still whetted by the pure air and morning's exercise. After dinner, while the applejack and old rye circulated freely, the candidates favored us with their views of state and federal politics, into which, however, nothing offensive or personal was suffered to intrude, and then the remainder of the evening was spent in horse racing, cards, social discussions on agriculture and politics, and such other amusements as the time and place suggested. All passed off as merry as a marriage bell, and the pleasures of the day would no doubt have been drawn out into twilight and the early hours of the night, had not an approaching storm warned us that it was time to seek shelter elsewhere. My friend had some short time before accepted an invitation to spend the night with an acquaintance he had met with during the day, and had gone off home with him, and I was about taking my solitary way back to the inn, when a gentleman, with whom I had been in conversation during the evening, one of those specimens of genuine hospitality almost always to be met with in the Virginia planter, came up and insisted that I should accompany him home. He said that he lived but a short distance off, and urged, as an additional reason, that the approaching storm would overtake me before I could make half the distance to my place of destination. The argument was conclusive, and I gladly accepted his kind invitation. A short ride brought us to his mansion. It was a large, old-fashioned two-story brick house, consisting of a center building, with two extensive wings, one of which was used as a kitchen and servants' hall. The building stood on an eminence, commanding an extensive view of the rich lowlands that surrounded it, and shaded by a magnificent grove of fine old forest trees. Supper was soon announced, and, after having done ample justice to the tempting fare set before us, we adjourned to the front yard to enjoy a cigar, accompanied by the fair lady of the house. The threatened storm had passed by, and instead of coming over, as we had anticipated, was sweeping along a distant mountain ridge, much to the regret of my friend, who informed me that the tobacco crop stood greatly in need of rain. Various topics were introduced and discussed as we sat thus sipping our mint juleps and puffing our highly perfumed Havanas, until at last we got upon the subject of dreams, supernatural visions, and ghosts. I had never been a believer in such things, and expressed myself so very freely. "No," said I, in reply to my friend's wife, who asked me if I'd seen anything of the kind. "Ghosts and hobgoblins have had their day, and, like other superstitions of a barbarous and ignorant age, have passed away with the great cause which usually engenders such beliefs. And like the idle tales of witchcraft, definitions and so forth of former times, would have been forgotten long ago but for the pernicious teachings of servants, who are proverbially superstitious, and with whom children are too often heedlessly left by their parents." My friend was silent and looked grave, while his wife looked at me with an expression so peculiar as to attract my attention. At length he said, "I do not think anyone who knew me a year or two ago would have charged me with possessing any inordinate share of superstition, and yet it is said that this very house in which we live is haunted." And then, after a pause, in which he seemed evidently striving hard to bring himself to the acknowledgment, he said, "And I believe it." I was much astonished by the acknowledgment, and looked at him closely to see if he was in earnest. He was very pale, and seemed evidently troubled with some unpleasant recollections of the past. That he was joking I could not for a moment believe, and yet he was a man of superior intellect, well educated and refined, and in mental capacity much above the ordinary standard. My curiosity was much excited to know by what combination of circumstances a man like him should have become so fully possessed with what I could not help but thinking was a very childish belief, and after some persuasion, in which I was seconded by his wife, he consented to gratify me. The ordinary bedtime having arrived, the lady arose and bid us good night. After she had retired, we replenished our juleps, lit a fresh cigar, and having resumed our comfortable armchairs, my friend began. "I have always," he said, "resided in this neighborhood, having been born on a farm about 20 miles from here. When I was a boy, I remember frequently to have heard it said that this place was the theater of strange and unaccountable sights and sounds, and was even at that day known as a haunted house. There was a dark tale of crime connected with one of the previous owners of the place, but as the circumstances had occurred long years before, and the man had since died, it had in a great measure been forgotten except by the older inhabitants of the neighborhood. Like many of the young men of my state, I was sent at an early age to a northern college, where I remained until my education was completed, only returning home for short periods each year during the vacation. On my final return home, after graduating, I found that the old stories about this place had been revived. The house had remained shut up for a long time, but had finally fallen into the hands of a new owner. This gentleman repaired the buildings, and had taken possession of the premises but a short time, when he suddenly broke up his establishment, offered the place for sale, and removed from the neighborhood. Another purchaser was found, but in a few months he also left nearly as suddenly as his predecessor, without assigning any reason for his strange haste. The place was again and again sold with nearly the same result, until finally no new purchaser could be found. It was then offered for rent, but no tenant would remain in the house longer than a few weeks, sometimes only a few days, throwing up their leases, and often submitting to quite serious pecuniary losses for the sake of getting off. It again began to be rumored that strange and mysterious sights and sounds were a frequent occurrence there, and that the annoyance arising therefrom was so great that no one could be found willing to submit to it. The place was finally offered free of rent to anyone who would live there and take care of the premises. Several tried it, but no one could be found who was willing to remain, and finally the place was deserted and the house again shut up. It had remained in this condition some years, when it was once again put up at auction. I attended the sale. There were few persons present and no bidders. Seeing that no one seemed disposed to buy, I bid what under ordinary circumstances would have been considered a very small sum for the estate, and was much astonished to find that after a few minutes it was knocked down to me. Several of my neighbors jestingly congratulated me upon my splendid purchase, and wished me joy in my future abode among the ghosts and evil spirits of the place. Being at that time a bachelor, but little preparation was needed in the way of repairs, fixing up, etc., and I soon found myself the occupant of my new home. At first I used to often think of the stories I had heard of the place, especially when alone at night, but as days and weeks and months passed without seeing or hearing anything supernatural or unusual, I at length came to the conclusion that all that had been said was only the result of gross ignorance and superstition magnified by timidity and cowardice. I had absolutely seen nothing, and the long nights of winter passed without any other sound than that produced by the howling of the wind about the chimney tops, or the scampering of rats through the empty rooms of my bachelor's hall. About this time I was married. I had newly furnished the house, and everything was gotten in readiness for the reception of my bride. That room, pointing to the windows of one just above our heads, being the most convenient and pleasant chamber in the house, I had fitted up with extra care for our sleeping apartment. My wife's family lived in an adjoining county. We were married in the morning, and immediately after the ceremony came over to this place, accompanied by our mutual friends. I had invited several of our neighbors to spend the evening with us, and most of us had retired to our rooms to prepare to receive our company. It was then about early candlelight, when the whole house was startled by a loud report like the discharge of a pistol, followed by a terrified scream from the ladies assembled in my wife's room. Everybody hastened to the spot. We found the ladies in a terrible state of alarm. They told us that while completing their toilets, they were gaily chatting together when they were all startled by the explosion, which had taken place immediately in the room they were occupying. My wife had been sitting at the time before a large full-length mirror, placed between the two front windows of the room, with her back turned towards it, and upon examination they found the mirror broken into 1,000 pieces and the fragments scattered over the floor. There, true enough, were the scattered fragments of the glass, but after a careful search nothing further could be found. We, however, assured the ladies that the accident could easily be accounted for, that the wooden frame of the mirror had shrunk by having a fire lighted in the room, and that the breaking of the glass from that cause had produced the explosion. Though I must confess that several of us, and myself among the number, were not at all satisfied with our own explanation. The reason assigned seemed, however, to allay the fears of the ladies, and the evening passed off without any further incident. A few nights after, my wife awoke me in great alarm. She told me that she had been awoke from a sound sleep by hearing a noise in the room, that she had listened and heard the tones of a female voice pleading apparently with someone, with great earnestness of manner, accompanied with frequent groans and sobs, that a rough, harsh voice seemed to reply, though neither were significantly distinct for her to catch any of the words. She was greatly agitated, and it was some time before I could soothe her, and I utterly failed to convince her that she was mistaken. Afterward, this thing was a frequent occurrence. At length one night she awoke me in a fearful state of agitation and alarm, crying, "Look, over there!" I looked in the direction indicated, and fancied I saw something resembling a thin white mist rapidly moving across the farther end of the room. In a moment I was wide awake, and endeavored to persuade her that it was only fancy, but I could not divest myself of the idea that I had myself seen something not altogether natural. My wife told me that she had been awakened some short time before by what seemed to be an earnest conversation between two persons in the passage near our door. Presently the door seemed to open, and a figure dressed in white glided in and paused for a moment near the foot of the bed. The form was that of a young female. Her hair was long and disheveled, her look wild and terrified, and in her arms she carried the body of a dead infant. She cast a most imploring look at my wife. At that moment she called me, when the figure at once moved off and disappeared to the opposite side of the room. Again and again the same occurrence took place, and each time my wife seemed more and more alarmed. I tried still to dissuade myself that it was mere fancy on her part. I had as yet seen nothing unusual myself, except the occurrence above mentioned, though I must confess that I had more than once heard sounds that could not easily be accounted for. We had now been married several months, and my wife was in that interesting condition in which ladies, and especially very young ones, are apt to have all sorts of strange imaginations. Her excitement was at times very great, so much so that I became seriously alarmed for her safety. I could not convince her that she had not seen a supernatural vision, and, as it only seemed to visit her in that room, I determined to change our sleeping apartment to another part of the house. We accordingly removed to the far wing where you see those lights. After that I was delighted to find that she was not again troubled. Some months passed by, and as nothing was heard of the ghost, we began almost to believe it was only fancy after all, when an old friend of mine came to visit us. Our former room, being decidedly the most comfortable and best furnished room in the house, was selected as his chamber while with us. The day after his arrival, while at breakfast, he asked if some of the family had not been sick during the night, as he had heard a great deal of noise as of persons walking about, and at times groans and other indications of distress. I told him that one of the servants was very sick, which was the case, but did not tell him that he was far from the dwelling in an outhouse, and that no one had been in that part of the house since he retired. Nothing more was said during the day about the noise. The next night, between 1 and 2 o'clock, I had been called out from the house in the early part of the night and had not yet retired. I heard a door slammed violently to, and a moment after, someone coming rapidly down the passage and up the steps toward our room. I hastily took up a lamp and went out to see what was the matter. I found it was my friend. He seemed greatly agitated, and his face was deadly pale. He told me he had been awakened in the same way as my wife had often been before, that he had seen the female figure enter with the dead child, had noted the imploring look, and at that moment a dark, terrible object had entered the door. He believed it was the devil, that the other figure uttered a piercing shriek and disappeared, when he too jumped out of bed and rushed from the room in extreme terror he scarcely knew where. No inducement could persuade him to again enter the room, and he slept for the remainder of the night in a room adjoining our own. The next day he seemed none the less impressed with the reality of what he had seen, stoutly declaring that it was no fancy, as he was wide awake at the time. What struck me as not a little strange was that I had known this gentleman for a number of years, having been at college with him, and knew well that he was not at all superstitious, and, so far from being timid, that he had always been considered daring even to recklessness. After this the noise in the room seemed to increase. At times the bell would ring violently. Then hurried steps would be heard as of persons moving about in great excitement. Then screams and groans, and at times a female voice as if pleading for mercy. I had the bell wire from that room taken off, but it made no difference. The bell still rang. I then had all the bells in that part of the house unhung and taken down, but it made no difference. The sound of bells ringing was still heard. I set a watch in every room, in fact resorted to every expedient that human ingenuity could devise, but to no effect. The sounds were still heard, and the mystery, instead of being solved, was only increased. We have never since occupied that room. Sometimes a friend staying with us has requested to be put in it for the night, but I have never known even the most daring among them desire to repeat the experiment. That one night was always sufficient for them. The noise at intervals still continues, and I assure you on my honor that I am at this moment as utterly unable to account for it as I was the first night my wife called my attention to it. Such was my friend's story. When he finished it, I said to him that if he had no objection, I would like to sleep in that room myself. He seemed somewhat astonished at my request, and tried hard to dissuade me from the attempt, assuring me that if I did this I would repent it before morning. I was, however, somewhat excited by the juleps I had drank, and as I had made the request, was obstinately bent on doing so, being influenced, no doubt, by the fear of being laughed at if I now backed out. He at length reluctantly assented, and as it was quite late, proposed that after we had taken a nightcap, we should retire. He accompanied me to my room. It was a large, fine apartment, furnished with everything that could contribute to comfort or luxury. Setting the lamp which he had in his hand on a table, he remained for a few moments in conversation, and then bidding me good night, withdrew. I hastily undressed, blew out the light, and jumped into bed. It is true that I thought of some of the strange sights and sounds that had been seen and heard in that room, but being very tired I soon fell asleep, when ghosts and other visions were for a time forgotten. How long I had been asleep I have no idea. I must have been for an hour or two, when I suddenly awoke with one of those strange, indefinable feelings of dread creeping over me. A consciousness of some supernatural presence, which everyone at times during their life has felt, and which it is difficult to account for as it is to describe. The moon, which had before been obscured, was again shining out, casting rays of pale, fitful light through the branches of the trees which overhung my chamber windows. Within the house a dread silence reigned, a silence which at that moment had something painful in it, while without, not even a breath of air stirred the leaves on the surrounding trees. The incidents of the conversation of the last evening came one by one back to my mind with startling vividness. I will not say that I was frightened, but I could not conceal from myself the fact that there was a growing feeling of dread creeping over me which was not at all agreeable, and against which it seemed for the time vain to struggle. Unconsciously I placed myself in an attitude to listen, when suddenly I was startled by the sounds of a light footstep passing the door. It paused for an instant, and then seemed to enter an adjoining room, and then for a moment all was quiet again. Then the echoes of a heavy footstep ascending the stairs sounded along the empty passages. There was something peculiarly horrifying in the very tread. It seemed to have nothing of human life in it, but was like the march of the dead keeping time to the music of the grave. It passed the door and ceased, and all was again still. A slight rustling noise caused me for a moment to turn my eyes towards the window, when there, full in the pale moonlight, stood the figure of the lady I had heard described, with the dead infant in her arms. She looked straight at me, and never till my dying days shall I forget that look. It was all of horror, remorse, and anguish that I had ever conceived. A moment, and the step in the passage was again heard. One imploring look, and the apparition vanished. The step approached the door. It flashed across my mind that I had carefully bolted it, and had turned the key before retiring. The step paused. I heard the knob turn, the click of the lock, and to my horror, the door slowly swung open. I looked, and my God, there full beside me stood the Demon Spectre, tall, lank, death-like, wrapped in a winding sheet which but half concealed the naked bones beneath, with hollow, fleshless cheeks and grinning teeth, with eyes of fire which blazed with all the demon hate of hell. It stood peering into every corner of the room as if searching for something. Presently it crossed along toward the foot of the bed, and, turning, those hellish eyes glared full upon me. I endeavored to spring from the bed. All power of motion was gone. Then I tried to scream, but my voice had left me. The cold damp of death stood upon my brow. I could neither speak nor move. The only power left me was to see, and my eyes followed every motion of the spectre. Presently it moved towards the window, and stood for some minutes gazing out into the moonlight. Then it turned again and approached the bed so close that I could feel the cold and chilling damps of the grave clothes upon me. Gazing still into my eyes, it stretched forth its long skeleton arm and hand, a hand upon which the grave worms had done their office, and reaching forward, placed it upon my face. The touch sent a chilling pang of horror through my very marrow. My blood froze. My heart stood still. I could stand it no longer. With one wild scream and a tremendous bound, I sprang from the bed. It was broad daylight. The sun was shining full into my room, and my friend stood beside me. He had entered some time before, with true hospitality bringing me a glass of his favorite beverage, and finding me in a sound sleep, had hesitated for some time to awaken me, and in the meantime had left me to suffer from an attack or nightmare, induced, no doubt, by the fish fry and the hearty supper of the night before. The end.